Well, good afternoon, and it's nice to be here. I've been instructed, by the way, by my colleagues that we have left this little pamphlet on your tables with a questionnaire that during the course of the talk and the speech, if you find yourself wandering off, which won't occur, because I'm going to keep us really engaged and focused here, please fill that out, and if you can obviously remain 100% engaged, do it afterwards, but we'd love to collect your thoughts and information on a survey that we're conducting. So let me begin, hopefully. Is this, here we go. The New Rules of Retail. The New Rules of Retail is a book that I co-authored with Robin Lewis, and it really had as a singular purpose the desire to answer one question, and that question is, what does it take to be successful in retail and consumer goods today? And think about retail broadly. That's covering all of the e-commerce, mobile apps, everything. So a very broad definition, but we really wanted to answer that question. And it's a question that had been posed to us by a large number of our clients. I spend a lot of time advising private equity funds in terms of making investments in consumer and retail goods. And they want to know, obviously, is this business going to sustain and what's driving its success? And we've also spent a lot of time working with a large number of leading companies like yourselves, helping them figure out what it takes to be successful. And so that was the premise and starting point for wanting to write this book. And it became particularly germane because we looked in almost every mature market and saw a large number of business failures. Failures which we think, by the way, are going to increasingly accelerate, as well as obviously a number of successes. And failures, some of those are going out of business, some are just not earning a reasonable economic return. Now, part of it could be driven by new business models, part of it is the companies themselves picking up on particular trends or fads, or just executing better. But we wanted to really put this into a context and say, is there something fundamental that's going through the retail and consumer industry that's driving a change now that we believe could be quite profound? And we think that is the case. Now, in order to answer that question, we said, let's step back and take a historical perspective on retailing. How has it evolved over time? And as we look at the way it's evolving and its evolution, are there certain characteristics that make this age particularly suitable to certain business models versus what has gone before, might have happened before? And we actually went back a long time. We decided to start in 1850, bring us through to 1950. We think that's a distinct period of retailing history, and I'll give you a few examples of that. Then from 1950 to about 1980, you have another very distinct period of retailing. And depending upon which markets you're talking about, it could be up until 1990 or a little bit further on. But then you enter what we claim here as the third wave of retailing, which is from 1980 onwards. And we're in the midst of that now. And it's the trends and all of the developments inside that particular era which we think are affecting all the businesses today. But let's step back and look at the three waves of retailing and have a silent movie here. Obviously, we're all familiar with today's retailers, you know, big, brash, full of stuff. But it wasn't always that way. If you think about it, going back to the turn of the last century, you had a very, very different world. There were lots of fragmented communities. You had limited disposable income. People were hard to reach, both in terms of marketing, messaging, and there was almost a degree of difficulty we can't imagine today in delivering goods to the people in these communities. Now, if you think about it, this is not unlike, by the way, people who might be investing or opening up operations in many parts of the developing world, because there are clearly communities like this today. I was spending some time talking to some Brazilian executives, and if you're out in Brazil and opening up operations, there are large numbers of communities still with limited disposable income, fragmented communities, hard to reach. And this is wave one of retailing. And wave one of retailing is characterized by producer power. Because you have so many unmet needs for those consumers, producers basically dictate what gets made and how it gets made and what the consumer accepts. And because basically they've got so many unmet needs, they just purchase it. If you think of the old adage of Henry Ford, it was, you can have a Model T Ford any way you like it as long as it's black, because it met his desires to manufacture a product, his efficiencies, etc. So what worked from a retail perspective in that era? It was actually regional department stores, regional general merchandising stores. They were the dominant model. What they would do is they would aggregate the goods that producers were making, bring them together, and the consumers would find their way to those locations. So it was the start of location, location, location being the adage for retail. And the consumers would go into these palaces of consumption. If you had some money, you'd buy something, but it was just a great day out for the family. It's hard to believe, but these were truly family trips that took place for people during this era. The other model that developed, particularly in the United States, was the catalog. Because again, you had hard-to-reach consumers. You'd put together what producers were making, and then you'd send them this catalog. And people loved to get the catalog again because it amplified and showed them everything that was available in society, even if they couldn't afford it. So those were the two dominant retail models at that time. If we fast forward to 1950, we enter another era. And here we see a tremendous explosion in two things. One, the infrastructure in the economy, roads, malls, shopping centers, etc. And this fundamentally changes the way in which goods are going to be distributed. And secondly, you start to see a massive increase in the productive capacity of society. So the amount of stuff that's being made increases dramatically. He was planning to make something, I'm sure. So what is Wave 2? Wave 2 is the era of marketing power. Here, on some simplistic notion, you could argue now that the supply of goods during the course of this era basically exceeds demand. However you think about demand. And obviously we've got an infinite amount of demand, but on some simplistic level, now there's a tremendous abundance of goods being made, particularly for the Western democracies. And in this era, you start to see the retail landscape being transformed again. From regional department stores and general merchandising stores, you now start to see national department stores taking over, the consolidation through that era. It's actually, in the United States, the dominant era of Sears. It's hard to believe, but Sears back then was way more dominant than Walmart is today. You also start to see, and maybe by the way, this was a golden era for Woolworths in that as well. For those of us who grew up in the UK, the department stores and people like Woolworths were the places we used to go and shop. But you also saw another set of models developing. For the first time, you had folks like Walmart starting in the late 60s, opening up to serve rural communities, underserved communities. You had the origination of the specialty model for the first time coming. The Gap in 1969 is founded, and so you have an integrated vertical retailer starting. And you also have, for the first time, lifestyle brands emerging. Ralph Lauren, who's a visionary, suddenly says, you know what? We can put a brand across a whole array of products at different price points associated with a lifestyle. This era itself is actually one which is characterized now by the desire and need, if you like, for retailers to begin a narrative with the consumer. Brand building, marketing power becomes important. So Levi's start investing and fusing in our brains, that Levi stands for blue jeans. Coca-Cola spending a lot of money. It's almost the halcyon days, if you like, of Mad Men and advertising, because people now are having to start to create desires for you to go to their goods because we've got a lot of goods and a lot of choices. Around 1980, we enter the third wave. And the third wave, we see a tremendous explosion and proliferation in retailing across the board. Huge amount of increase in square footage, huge increase in the goods that all of these retailers are selling. You've got unlimited choices for the consumer. It's easy to access it. It's bright, just the amount of investment that's taking place. And suddenly you start to see now the shift really manifesting itself from producers controlling things to now consumers having so much choice that they are having a tremendous amount of control. And again, on this simplistic notion, wave 3 is consumer power, whereby there is so much stuff and so many choices that having a great product at a great price and a great store is the entry price now for competition. It doesn't buy you much at all. Everybody's got that. There's something else that's going to differentiate you if you're going to succeed. So let's spend a minute or two and dwell into what are the characteristics of consumer power, both how they've got that power and what is it that they're actually looking for that retailers and consumer companies need to respond to. Consumer power is driven by accessibility, what I term here the power of total accessibility. Firstly, there's more and cheaper access. If we look at the United States, there's almost an uninterrupted, through every economic cycle, of retail square footage expansion. And as you can see, a slight downturn maybe during the recession, but we're back off again, increasing square footage. And this is at a time, of course, when you've had a massive increase in online selling capacity as well. It's happened across the globe. Again, the US outstripping everybody. This is retail square footage per capita. But in the US, you see in the UK, even in the emerging economies like Brazil, just a tremendous amount of selling capacity that now exists in the marketplace. Same time, we've seen a huge increase in the amount of stuff. If you go back to 1980, and I remember sort of growing up and being livid with my parents when they didn't get me Levi's for Christmas, but there was only in 1980 or so a few denim brands that mattered. 6 or so, maybe Levi's, Wrangler, Gap, a couple others. Now there are over 800 blue denim brands that are tracked regularly for their sales. An incredible proliferation. But it's not just here in apparel. It's happened in every sector. 1968, you could have one flavor of Pringles chips. Today, they make 33 different flavors. And if you think about all the competitors in the snacking aisle, all trying to create more and more nuanced product, you can see just what's happening. Think of the drinks aisle. There was a time when tap water sufficed with some Ribena. And now just think as you walk down that aisle, the incredible selection that we have. At the same time this has gone on, there's been a dramatic decrease in costs. So it's a lot cheaper for consumers. They can buy more. We all might lament right now that China's about to export inflation to us all. But for the last 15, 20 years, it has been a massive exporter of deflation. This T-shirt, the costs back in early 1990s, almost double what they are today. So you've had now the access, both in terms of product design proliferation, but also everything became an awful lot cheaper. So the consumer just has way more choices than they've ever had before. Quicker and easier access. I don't think we need to spend much time on this. We all know it. You started with just catalogs. Think of the proliferation of catalogs, how many you get in the mail now, the number of stores we've talked about, and then all of the other devices, mobile apps, online requirements trying to reach the consumer. You can shop 24/7. Actually, on my flight over, I have to say I enjoyed just the catalog on the airplane and bought some more stuff. And if they'd had a Wi-Fi across the Atlantic, I'd have even bought more, I think. So you can shop 24/7. And the consumer's smarter. On some level, there's an information overload we can talk about. Between 1999 and 2002, it's estimated that the amount of information stored digitally was the equivalent to 37,000 Libraries of Congress. Over the last 10 years, that increased tenfold. And by some estimates, there are 50 billion websites, which means as we approach 7 billion, 7 websites for every individual person. There's just an incredible amount of information out there. Now, if you put that on a practical level, what does it mean? It means, first of all, that the consumer, off the bat, can price compare, shop anything that has a barcode. So if you're in the business of selling products with barcodes, that's not unique, exclusive, huge margin compression already underway. The consumer is now able instantaneously to take a smartphone, scan it, and just see where else they can buy it cheaper than what the store's offering. The next generation of these, of course, are now going to do product comparisons. So you may want to go and buy a Sanyo TV. They'll prompt you with all of the other TVs that seem to meet the requirements of a Sanyo TV and what the prices are of those and where you can buy those. So again, the consumer is way smarter than they've ever been before. And because of that, retailers have constantly tried to elevate their performance to meet the consumer needs, which has raised the expectations for the consumer, that's elevated again what retailers need to do. So the consumer, even if they're not directly choosing things and know what they want, because of all of the choices and all the experimentation that people like yourselves are putting out in the marketplace, have the ability to decide what they want. And so you've seen this century-long shift from the producer deciding what's occurred and profits occurring by and large closer to the point of manufacture, to profits now going closer and closer to those who understand and can serve the consumer more closely. As I said at the beginning of this footage, which showed those people, in the farms or in the Monty Python-esque world of, you're lucky you had a rag to suck on back then, and going to find goods in stores, to now being the consumer in the center, where basically everything is trying to get to them, whether it's the stores, the mobile apps, the catalogs, shopping on the TVs, etc. Just incredible proliferation. And we've seen this shift from value creation of people just really working to increasingly people viewing themselves as consumers of value. So if they're in the center of everything, what do they want? As the consumer has become more and more important, we believe there's been 5 fundamental shifts that have taken place. The first one is the consumer's gone from needing stuff to demanding experiences. Everywhere you go, you hear stories of people having closets full of stuff. They don't want more stuff. They want experiences. Now, there's a lot of research that's been done by social scientists, behavioral economists, etc., on the power of an experience. Any purchase that has a high experiential content, 6 months after the event, has way higher levels of satisfaction than anything that is just purely stuff or closer to a material purchase. So retailers obviously have responded with the nightclub atmosphere of Abercrombie and Fitch, sort of the Lululemon trying to put as much content into the stores as possible to create an experience that somebody goes there for, including even yoga classes, etc. Because it's undoubted that people don't need new stuff. They're not looking for that. They're looking for something experiential. I think it's one of the reasons, again, in the food sector, you can start to see it. People don't just need more food, they want something that's tailored to them. So it's organic, it's healthy, and you start to see all of the proliferation again as people are looking for more experiential stuff in almost every sector. People have gone from conformity to customization. There may well have been a time when we could all go to the same store, the same department stores, and buy the same clothes and feel comfortable with it. But that era has ended. Everybody now is an individual and views themselves as an individual. They may well actually be a member of multiple different tribes, if you like, during the course of any given day, but each of their identities within those groups are relatively individualized. So I can be a sports fan one day, I can be a businessman one day, I can go out another day. And what I want to wear, what I want to buy to express myself as part of that, I want to have customized to me. So retailers who enable me to both customize their products, obviously, but also provide something unique, customized to me, is incredibly valuable. And to some degree, this one trend alone would explain why the gap has continually had to shrink in the face of what I refer to as an infinite number of finite tribes. We can't all just wear the same denim from the Gap anymore, and we won't. We've gone from plutocracy to democracy. There was a time again when relatively exclusive product was only available to a few. And with this proliferation of goods, people now expect to be able to access the best brands wherever they go, whether that's Vera Wang, who at the very high end for wedding dresses, or all the way down to what's sold at Kohl's in the United States. Obviously, Ralph Lauren has done it with a tiered strategy, both in terms of distribution, price points, and product. But people want to be able to access some luxury items. And even though aspirational luxury has been badly hit during the course of this recession, there's still that desire in the consumer to save up to buy something that they truly value, that they perceive as being luxurious, and they can access it. It's available to everybody. We've gone from new to new and now. So of course people always wanted new stuff, but the whole development cycles have changed dramatically to new and now, where I want to go into a store that I was in last week or a few weeks ago, and I want to see something refreshing, changed, different. And that my expectations on that, because so many retailers are able to execute this, is that that's something I'm going to see. And if I don't deliver against that premise, I'm going to be disappointed. And obviously, we can look at the phenomenal growth of the fast fashion retailers from Mango, Zara, H&M, etc., who epitomize it. But it's not just in that sector. I believe it's in every sector where people want to go into a store and they want to see something new and they want to see it every time they go, which is now. And finally, we've seen a shift from just self to community. And this is an interesting take again in terms of how people have gone from conformity to customization, but they still are seeking community. As I've said, there are infinite number of finite tribes and people move between tribes. But it's manifesting itself in a lot of profound ways as well. So for example, Nestle found themselves struggling with consumers on YouTube who came out saying, you know what, Nestle suppliers are destroying the rainforests. A huge community exists out there, very quickly accessed, that influences where Nestle can source from. A lot of brands actually can't control their brand message anymore. P&G launched a new diaper that they claimed didn't cause diaper rashes, but with the social networking communities, the mothers were so dominant, they actually had to pull back the product. So the question is, if we've had these consumer market shifts, what does it take to be successful in this environment? We believe there are 3 fundamental rules or principles, if you like, that drive success for retailers. And I'll talk about each of these in turn, but they are neurological connectivity, preemptive distribution, and underlying all of that, an operating model that gives you superior control or collaboration of the value chain, and most importantly, control over the experience the consumer has on utilizing, acquiring your product. Let's talk a little bit about each of these. So neurological connectivity. This is an experience that connects with the 5 senses and the 6th sense, the mind. So obviously it embodies everything we would think about in terms of classic brand management. Great product, great associations, loyalty, awareness, etc., etc. But everybody claims that and says they have that. But we actually, in a lot of the research we did, found and believe that those who are really winning are doing something above and beyond that, something quite often that the consumer themselves can't even articulate and can't even necessarily recognize. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first one here is a study that was done by a group of scientists looking at rats. And the rats ran around a maze. And in one control group, they just had them run around a maze all day, didn't do anything. In the other control group, they would paint the walls or slightly change the way the maze was constructed. And then they just measured the responses of the rats, both how they behaved, but interestingly enough, they also wanted to measure the levels of dopamine production. Now, you may or may not know that dopamine is a chemical in the brain that we all manufacture that's associated with euphoria, satisfaction, happiness, and also addiction. And what was most interesting about this particular study was that the rats in the maze, well, literally they would just paint one of the walls red in one part of the maze. The rats would visit that part of the maze way more frequently than any other part of the maze. And also, those rats had higher levels of dopamine production. And it was interesting as we thought about the new and now concept and the retailers who are constantly changing the environment, who are flowing new goods into the stores, are literally creating a dopamine reaction for their consumers. Another example, at Emory University, they had 2 control groups where they dripped Kool-Aid into the mouths of the participants. In one group, they dripped it in a regular basis, and in the other group, they dripped it in an irregular basis. And what was most interesting about this one was that the group that had Kool-Aid dripped in their mouths in an irregular basis had higher levels of dopamine production again. But not when they actually received the Kool-Aid, they actually got it in anticipation of getting the Kool-Aid. So the thought of actually getting a reward triggered a chemical response from those participants. And again, there are many business models you think about where the treasure hunt phenomena is a powerful, powerful part of their business model. In the United States, Costco has a whole section set up because of treasure hunting, where you don't know what's going to be in that section, but you go into it and you're excited to go to the store and you're excited to rummage around because there's an anticipation you're going to find some incredible deal. Now, obviously, they do a great job delivering great value on the perimeters of the store. That's the price of entry. But one of the reasons why Costco is so dominant is because people are going there in anticipation of finding something great. So retail models, again, where you're creating this type of response from the consumer, even though they may or may not know it, is actually driving their behavior. How many of you have been on Gilt? If you've been to Gilt, they have a snap auction at 12 o'clock every day where there's going to be a limited amount of merchandise at great prices. They're literally creating a chemical response. It's amazing for those people who get addicted to shopping on Gilt. At 5 to 12, they know exactly the time, stop working, not going out for lunch, click onto the site, get ready for the select sales. It's one of the biggest ways in which they drive traffic. And in our vernacular, it's creating a neurological connection. So what is it in a more business sense? It's the pre-shopping anticipation. It's the sense you're going to get some reward that's unique, credible, and experienced every time by going to that store. It's the actual shopping experience. One of the reasons you can argue that Starbucks struggled so much was that in a desire to actually increase efficiency, they took out the experiential element of a lot of the coffee shops. And so no longer having the aroma of roasted coffee, no longer having the beans there for sale, no longer knowing the barista who was making your drink was a huge negative. One of their turnaround strategies is to put that all back. And obviously it's the consumption or using the product or service itself. And there are a number of great retailers who do this. My personal favorite, I think, is Lululemon, because they just create such a great environment. First off, there's always new merchandise going there. There's always new community activities. There's classes there. And then they've got a fantastic product that outperforms any of its competitors. So they're performing on all levels. Another great example, I think, is Zara. For those of you who shop Zara regularly, there's a regular cadence of which new goods flow into their stores. So the Zara aficionados know that on the second Tuesday of every month, there's going to be a flow of product that's limited, exclusive, and I have to get there to see what's going on. They also have, obviously, a large number of short-run items coming through that if you're not in the stores reasonably regularly, you're going to miss. And again, a consumer may not be able to articulate why they shop there on average 17 times versus 4 times for a traditional retailer. But it's because all of these elements are built into the business model. They literally have, I'm not quite sure what this graphic means, but I liked it, a rat drinking the Kool-Aid. But it seemed to bring the two studies together somehow. Anyway, preemptive distribution, the second principle we have. This is because the consumer has so many choices and so many people trying to reach them, you have to have an ability to reach your consumer first, more often, and the ways that they want. Now, the biggest preemptive distributor is actually neurological connectivity. So to the extent the business model is creating that environment that's driving the consumer there, they will walk past, drive past, or surf past the competitor sites that pop up. But there's other elements to it as well, and let me just give you a couple of examples. Let's zoom down on any small town in America. Actually, it's not such a small town, and they just won the World Series, apparently, so for those of you who know, that's baseball. Anyway, St. Louis, Missouri. In St. Louis, Missouri, they had a sprawling suburban community of working mums. And a working mum has a job, possibly 2 jobs. She's looking after kids. She's time-starved. You know, she's on a budget. And there's a large community of those folks. Traditionally, they had been served by JCPenney. And as you can see, JCPenney is down the road. It's actually not that far, maybe a 5-minute drive. And if we zoom in a little bit, you know, we can see it's pretty convenient, ample parking, nice place to go and shop. Kohl's had a preemptive strategy. They recognized there were all of these new communities that had sprung up across the United States and that they could ring-fence the existing competitors, JCPenney. They plopped the Kohl's right between the working mums and JCPenney. And arguably, when you look at the retail expansion of Kohl's, this is one of the fundamental reasons why they took out $10 billion from JCPenney's revenues, because they literally were able to serve that time-starved customer way more effectively by being preemptive in their distribution strategy. So using your retail stores, figuring out what are traffic patterns, how you use multi-channel to be preemptive, we think is a critical ingredient. And this was a very successful strategy because, at least at this time, the product differentiation, and arguably even today between these retailers, is not that immense. Amazon has done the same thing. They have a huge neurological connector, which is Prime. For those of you who shop regularly on Amazon or are Prime members, the fact that you've got free next-day delivery has just been a huge benefit to Amazon. Economically, you can argue, the pros and cons of the level of investment they've put into it. But in terms of driving traffic, driving revenue to their site, it's been incredibly successful. So it's a neurological connector. But operationally, Amazon did a very interesting thing as well. In the United States, UPS is the predominant shipper of all of the goods to people for delivery, 1-2 days. Amazon actually co-located their DCs right next door to UPS. Not only did this enable them to be much more efficient, cost-effective, it means they've got later cutoff times for prime users. So you can literally order something at 5 to 9 in the United States and have it delivered to your house next day. In fact, for most of the markets right now, Amazon has the capacity under all of their delivery mechanisms to provide next day delivery. They just choose not to. So at some point, that's going to become something that is prevalent, certainly in the US. I'm not so familiar with the UK. So that's some examples of preemptive distribution. There are many, many different examples. But again, how do you get in front of the consumer more often, more frequently with your value proposition in a better way than your competitors? But the fundamental thing which we believe is that you actually can't do that, these other two principles, without superior control of the value chain. And if it's not control, it's collaboration. So one of the things we don't want to emphasize here is that you need to own the parts of the value chain, but the point of collaboration is something that the winners are increasingly influencing more and more. So Ralph Lauren, for example, will dictate what actually goes inside the stores, their department store partners, how the square footage is utilized, what adjacencies are there, how the staff is there, the lighting, the music, the ambience. They want to control that. And we're seeing it increasingly again. If you look inside grocery right now, tremendous amount of studies and work being done by people trying to figure out how they have their products put in the optimal place inside the grocery stores. Hershey's done an awful lot of work to understand what triggers people's buying habits inside the store. So it's all about controlling not only the development of the product and the cycles through, but at the point of consumption. An inherent advantage, of course, for retailers themselves who can and should own that relationship with the consumer. It's one of the reasons why specialty retailers have been such a phenomenal growth vehicle for 20 or 30 years. And I can't do justice to all the elements of value chain control now, but it really is a broad definition. So it's much broader than supply chain, although it encompasses the supply chain elements. It's thinking about the point of value origination, creating the dreams, the experience, the product itself, and defining sort of what the brand relevance is to the consumer. It's how you deliver that and how you make sure that you are the person who's controlling that point of consumption and dictating the experience that the consumer has, because that, as we've already argued, is such a powerful motivator of ongoing consumer behavior. And then obviously it's the ongoing development of that particular product or experience for the consumer, both in terms of back-end productivity strategies as well as front-end marketing strategies. So there's an awful lot of detail and discussion one could have about how to do this most effectively. One of the things which we wanted to do, though, was to look across all retail sectors and basically come up and identify, are there a set of principles that determine whether or not you're in the value segment, the luxury segment, almost anywhere that drive success? And we believe there are. And we identified 3 core principles which we think determine, or if you like, divide between those who are being successful and those who've become increasingly irrelevant. The first one is increasing collaboration. This is collaboration both in terms of working with your customers, working with your vendors, it's working with your internal organization, how it flows information. So there's a tremendous amount involved in terms of collaboration. But a lot of the most successful business models have increasingly been able to exploit collaboration, particularly with a lot of their consumers. A sort of trivial but fun example, I think, is Pop Idol. One of the reasons it's so phenomenally popular is it enables an ongoing collaboration between the show itself and the audience, because they're voting and the X Factor the same way and participating in a perfect vehicle in a world full of social networking sites where people want to talk to each other non-stop. They've increased their collaboration dramatically. A lot of companies now also allowing consumers to actually design some of the products, to be involved in, again, collaborating and creating something. Shrinking decision times. This is not only relevant, I think, obviously to the apparel sector, where your ability to flow goods in much faster, quicker than your competitors, to have those short cycles to stimulate the consumer, to stimulate demand and those return visits, which we've already talked about. But it's across the board in terms of how quickly are you as an organization able to implement new technologies? How do you get the organization to speed that up, whether or not it's developing a new app, a new technology, integrating some of the inventory across the different distribution channels, etc. And the third element, which we identified, is a demand-responsive value chain. So many retailers historically have tried to forecast demand, thinking again, what is it that the consumer is going to buy? We make it, we push it out there, and then the best tool and strategy is a markdown optimization tool. Increasingly, the real winners are those that are able to have shorter runs, shorter cycles, flowing goods in, and are actually producing what the consumer is demanding. And so again, it requires a differential level of investment in the supply chain, the productive capacities, the way you manage the network. And interestingly enough, a lot of retailers, the justification for the investment in the infrastructure would not stand on its own if you didn't put it into a bigger picture in terms of what does the brand stand for the consumer and how does it drive their behavior. In order to see if we had any validity in this, we actually went out and interviewed 400 executives and asked them to rank retail concepts, retailers that they were familiar with across each of those three principles, just on a scale of 1 to 5. And then we put each of the retailers we knew into a different bucket, first quartile, second, third. And at the beginning of the time period in 2002, they roughly broke down into 25% of the market capitalization of our sample. What we found by 2010, those that had been placed in the top quartile had actually created approximately 75% or so of the entire value creation on the retail industry for that cohort. And those that have been placed in the bottom quartile, just in terms of operating performance, using the wisdom of crowds across a large sample size, had actually created no economic value, and 25% of that sample had actually gone bankrupt. So we think that there's some real validity in this. And the implications, and I'll just flash through these really quickly, because I think if you integrate this thesis, an argument we have, we think it's got pretty profound implications. The first one is that we think 50% of all brands and retailers will disappear because the fight to get in front of the consumer with a differentiated experience is going to be so immense. And this isn't a prediction, by the way. This is just a graphic. But we think you're going to see a large number of these guys just disappear because they're not going to be able to create that experience that the consumer wants. And particularly if you're a wholesaler and you're just making goods and you now no longer own that point of interaction, you're potentially fundamentally challenged. Wholesale brands are going to accelerate their retail store openings. We already see it, Polo, North Face, Microsoft, but it's going to be a massive proliferation. How about this? P&G's opening up dry cleaners and car washes. Again, a way of trying to create that brand connection with their consumer. Traditional retailers are going to increase their own private or exclusive brands. In a world where everybody can cross-shop, tremendous amount of similar goods, having the capacity and the ability to create your own brands. It's occurred here probably faster than it has in the US, where we still only see about 20% of private brands inside the grocers. But that's going to dramatically change, and I think for all retailers it's a key ingredient of success. Department stores are going to break up and start rolling out their own private branded specialty chains. Again, the specialty model is so valuable and you can control the space so much, it's so critical. Small store strategies will accelerate the desire to be preemptive, to get in front of the consumer with a new format. Pop-up stores, eBay's doing some great pop-up stores right now, key strategic priority versus a marketing tool historically. Department stores are going to lease space. They've got too much square footage, they can't put it out, and they need people to come in and control that environment. Selfridge has obviously been a leader in this. And finally, we're going to see Amazon and other people opening up stores, not traditional stores, but new types of stores to showcase goods, to micro-market into communities. And that's, in a nutshell, the new rules of retail. Thank you.